Well, good evening and welcome to Phoenixville Public Library. I'm Mark Pinto, and welcome to tonight's event, The Laughing Lincoln. We are pleased to have back with us for at least the third time historian Roger Arthur. And I'd like, first of all, to thank the Friends of the Phoenixville Library for sponsoring tonight's program. I know there's a couple of friends out there in the audience, so thank you. Our speaker tonight, Roger Arthur, currently teaches modern American history at Bishop Shanahan High School in Downingtown. He also teaches a variety of adult enrichment courses at the Chester County Night School, Manor College, and Mainline School Night. He speaks to Civil War roundtables, libraries, colleges, and community groups very often. He has his bachelor's in history, government, and speech from Bowling Green State University and his master's in American history from Westchester University. In addition to lecturing on various historical topics for the last 30-some years, no, 20-some years it looks like. He has also taught American history and government and in the Cincinnati public schools, and worked in the marketing department for Sunoco for 30 years. So please welcome our guest tonight, Roger Arthur.
Mark, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the library once again. What we're going to talk about is Lincoln's humor, and it's between Benjamin Franklin and Mark Twain. In the history of the country, Abraham Lincoln was probably the funniest American. And it's fitting that in his last conscious sound, the last conscious sound that he heard was the laughter of the audience at Ford's Theater. Where does humor come from? If I could explain that to you, if I could tell you where that happens, I could answer a very large question, but you either have it or you don't have it. Things are either funny or they're not funny. Things that are funny to my wife are not all funny to me, and vice versa. When asked why he told so many stories and cracked so many jokes, Lincoln said, "I laugh because I must not cry." And I think that when we think of Abraham Lincoln many times, we think of the tremendous melancholy that overwhelmed him, and you know, he lived a pretty tragic life in many ways. The war, his political career was on the rocks several times. He tried without success to be elected to the Senate twice. He failed to be reelected to Congress. If he succeeded in anything, he succeeded at being an attorney. And things that you should know about Abraham Lincoln, other than the fact that he was president, was that he was always a lawyer, and he was always a politician. And he was always a politician first. He said, "If I could not tell jokes, I would die." His business partner, his law partner, Billy Herndon, said he saw the humor in everything. So where did it come from? Where did Lincoln's humor really come from? Well, I suspect that it came from childhood. You know, I don't know that he learned it from his father, but his father used to take him to the general store when they were on the farm, first in Kentucky and then in Indiana. And they, you know, at the end of the day or at the end of the week, there's not a lot to do. So the men would gather at the general store and they'd sit around at the Cracker Barrel and the pot-bellied stove, and they'd tell yarns to each other. And they'd tell stories. And some were good, and some were funny, and some were very interesting, but they were all entertaining. And young Lincoln would sit and listen to these and learn to mimic those stories. And when you think of Lincoln, you think of the great speeches that he made, and you can trace that back to what he read as a boy. When he was a boy, his mother, not Nancy Hanks, I don't think, but I think it was Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln, who taught him to read. And what he read was what they had. He read the Bible. And he read it over and over and over again and memorized many parts of it. Later, he got a copy of Aesop's Fables and was fascinated with that. And in his adult life, he began to read Shakespeare and was just enthralled with Shakespeare. He loved the tragedies better than the comedies. So when Lincoln spoke to people, sometimes in conversation and sometimes in his speeches. He often spoke in parables, you know, a parable or a fable, you know, with a moral at the end. And that's one of the things that Lincoln did. He said, my father taught me to work. He didn't teach me to love it. He said, I never did like to work. I'd rather sit around here and tell stories and jokes, anything but work. It's probably why I became a lawyer. I'm serious when I say that. You know, you laugh and I appreciate that, and he would appreciate that. But that's not to disparage anything about the profession of the law. Lincoln knew that the rest of his life he did not want to spend swinging an axe. He did not want to be mauling rails at 55. You know, he studied the law so that he could sit down and actually use his brain rather than his strong back. At first, his humor was biting humor. It was terribly sarcastic. And, you know, he could make fun of people pretty easily. His partner Billy Herndon said, you know, he saw the humor in everything. One time he was walking down the street in Washington, D.C. with William Seward, his Secretary of State, and they saw a sign, and he said, look, Seward, see that sign? T.R. Good. Coffee are better. His sarcasm got him into trouble. It actually, I don't know if you knew it or not, but Lincoln had been challenged to a duel in his Springfield days. Apparently, the state of Illinois had passed tax laws that would only accept gold or silver in payment of taxes, hard money as they called it. Always before, people had paid their taxes with Illinois state banknotes. They'd get, you know, they'd put their money in the Illinois State Bank, and when it was time to pay their taxes, they'd get the Illinois State banknotes, which was the currency of the time. There were no U.S. dollars that you and I would recognize today. That didn't actually come about until the war. And the government started to print greenbacks because they didn't have any gold to give you. They'd just give you paper. Anyway, back in the 1840s, Illinois passed a law that said that they would only accept hard money in payment of taxes. Lincoln wrote, and the tax collector was a man named James Shields. James Shields was a Democrat. And he was about 5'7", maybe 5'7½". And he was the tax collector, and he was relentless in collecting the taxes. So Lincoln wrote a scathing letter to the Sangamon Journal, pretending to be an old widow woman who had been wronged by Mr. Shields, and because she had to give hard money to pay the taxes on her farm, you know, she was now going to lose the farm because she didn't have enough money to operate it, and on and on and on and on. And painted Shields to be a real rascal. Now, whether Shields was a rascal or not, I don't know, nor is that important to the story. Shields was insulted by that, and he went to the editor of the Sangamon Journal, and he asked the editor to divulge the source of that letter, because he knew it wasn't written by any widow woman. He suspected it was written by somebody else. Well, in those days, you know, when he threatened the editor gave Lincoln up in a New York Minute, you know, he said it was Lincoln. So Shields challenged Lincoln to a duel. Shields at 5'7" or so, and Lincoln. You know that Lincoln was the only president to grow after he died? Did you know that? It's true. Lincoln, in his own autobiography, said that he described himself as 6'4" nearly, which means that he knew that he wasn't 6'4". He was, and historians before that always reported him at about 6'3", 6'3½". As soon as Lyndon Johnson became president, he was 6'4". The Lincoln people could not stand the idea that this Texan was taller than their man. So now Lincoln is always reported as 6'4". True story. Anyway, Shields challenged Lincoln to a duel, and as the aggrieved party, Lincoln had the choice of weapons. He chose cavalry broadswords. Cavalry broadswords stands about that high. And the idea was that they would fight. Dueling was illegal in that part of Illinois, probably in all parts of Illinois. So they had to go over on an island in the Mississippi River to have this duel so they wouldn't break the law. So they went over there, and the idea was that there would be a 12-foot plank between them. And neither man could cross the plank, but he could reach across it. And Lincoln, with his height and his long arms and this cavalry broadsword, starts swinging it over his head, you know, and Shields is taking a look at him and starting to take the measure of Lincoln and thinking, if I get close enough to even hit him with my sword, he'll cut my head off. So they appealed to the seconds, who ultimately settled the problem. So Lincoln avoided the duel, but he learned a valuable lesson that sarcastic use of humor is not a good idea, and it can be just terrible. So he began to use his humor against himself. He did a lot of self-deprecating humor. And you know, I know that many of us look at Lincoln and you know, we're so used to seeing pictures of him and his face on the money and so forth. We don't particularly think of Lincoln as ugly. But in his day, he was considered an ugly man. And he even said that he was an ugly man. And he said that the one case in point was he was riding the circuit. He was traveling down a country road in his buggy, and there was a woman coming the other way in her buggy. And she stopped and she looked at him and she said, "My word, sir, I believe you are the ugliest man I ever saw in my life." And he said, "Well, I think I agree with you, but I don't know what I could do about it." She said, "Well, you could stay home." Another time during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas had accused Lincoln, you know, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln 6'3½", Douglas about the same size as Shields, only a lot plumper. You know, they were really cutting Mutt and Jeff on the platform. And Douglas had accused Lincoln of being two-faced, and Lincoln got up during his turn on the debates, and he stood up and he says, "I ask you plainly," he said, "Judge Douglas has called me ugly." He said, "Do you think if I had it," he said, he called me two-faced. He said, "I ask you plainly, if I had another face, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" After he'd been elected president, then they left Springfield in February to go to Washington for the inauguration. The train left Springfield and it went to Chicago, and from Chicago it went to Indianapolis, and Indianapolis to Cincinnati, and to Columbus and Cleveland, Buffalo and Albany. So, and as they're riding along, the train would stop to take on water and wood, and Lincoln would come out on the platform and he'd make a few remarks to the people and wish them well and that sort of thing. And one crowd demanded to see Mrs. Lincoln. Very rarely did Mrs. Lincoln and the president ever appear together in public. Now they had back in Springfield, but on the stump, no, they had never done that, and hardly ever done that. So he went in the car and says, "Mother, come on out here. These people want to meet you." So she put on her shawl and she came out, and he says, "Well, here you have the Lincolns, the long and the short of it." If Douglas and Lincoln were Mutt and Jeff, Mary and Lincoln were Mutt and Jeff. One time somebody asked him what it was like to be president. He said it was a lot like being the man who was ridden out of town on a rail. He said if it wasn't for the honor of it, he'd rather walk. Oftentimes he would use his humor to make a point. He would say, "Well, that reminds me of a farmer back in Illinois." And as soon as he started that, you knew you were in for one of Lincoln's cornball stories. And he used that tactic in his office a lot, because he was completely overwhelmed time after time after time with office seekers. In those days, you know, the president appointed every government official who wasn't elected, including the postmasters and, you know, the customs collectors and everything. And there were people who just you know, wouldn't let him alone. He's completely inundated with office seekers. So many times they'd come to his office and they'd sit and they'd chat. And you could just walk right in the White House and go upstairs into the president's office. Lincoln's office there was no West Wing when Lincoln was president. His office was above where the East Room is now. It's what they would call the Lincoln bedroom. The White House that exists today is not Lincoln's White House. That was all redone during Harry Truman's administration, so it's all brand new inside. It's 50, 60 years old. brand new. But compared to what it had been, it was, you know, air conditioning and steel girders and all that sort of thing. But anyway, people would walk into Lincoln's office and they'd sit down and they'd talk to him. And he knew that he had things to do, so he'd get up. He'd say, you know, that reminds me of a farmer back in Illinois. He'd put his arm around the guy and start walking him toward the door. And when he got to the punchline, the guy would be in the hall and Lincoln would be back working. He told a story one time about how hard it was to deal with slavery. And he said, that reminds me of the story of a farmer back in Illinois. He had this old hog. He said, this was the meanest old boar hog he ever did see. He said, that hog was just plain nasty. So nasty, in fact, that he told his boys, he said, boys, whatever you do, don't get near that hog. You get in that sty and that hog will jump on you and kill you. So he says, if it comes to slopping that hog, he says, I'll take care of that. So the farmer always did that. And one day he was up on the fence and he'd slopped the hog and he lost his balance and he fell in the sty and the old hog come after him. And he quick jumped up on the back of the hog and he's holding by his ears just to keep his balance, and he was on, and he couldn't let go and he couldn't get out of there. And pretty soon he saw his sons walking up the drive, and he says, come on boys, come on over here and help me let go of this hog. And he says, letting go of that hog is a lot like trying to let go of slavery. He says, we just can't quite do it. He was in his office one time looking out the window, and he saw his friend George Julian from Indiana, congressman from Indiana, come up the driveway. He came up the driveway and he knew that Julian was going to pester him for some sort of an office for a friend of his. And Julian came in and he says, Lincoln, he says, I've got a friend who needs to be appointed to be a brigadier general. And Lincoln didn't want to appoint Julian's friend to be a brigadier general. He had plenty of brigadier generals already. And he says, Julian, he says, you remind me of a farmer back in Illinois. Julian started rolling his eyes. And he says, this farmer had a son, he said. And one day the farmer said to his son, he said, son, he says, I think it's time you took a wife. And the boy said, Dad, I agree with you. Whose wife should I take? And then he said, Julian, if I give your friend a brigadier generalship, that means I got to get rid of some other one. So which one should I get rid of? And Julian just threw up his hands and walked away. And Lincoln was always pestered with people who wanted jobs. And one time, the ambassadorship to the Sandwich Islands came available. You know where the Sandwich Islands are, right? You know, anybody know the Sandwich Islands?
Hawaii.
Hawaii, yeah, they're out in Hawaii. They were called the Sandwich Islands, named for the Earl of Sandwich, not Cornwall. Their island, Earl of Sandwich. And so Lincoln was going to appoint an ambassador to the Sandwich Islands. And this group of Republicans came and they talked about their man and what a good Republican he was and how he raised a lot of money and worked hard on the canvass and helped people get elected and on and on and on. And he had developed an illness and they thought that this illness was terrible for him and that if he could just spend some time in the Sandwich Islands, that would go a long way to cure him. And Lincoln very sympathetically nodded and said, uh-huh. And he said, now what can I do for you? And they said, well, we'd like to have him appointed ambassador to the Sandwich Islands. He says, well, I hate to disappoint you, but I think I already appointed an ambassador who was sicker than your man. And there was another fellow who pestered Lincoln for his judgeship. He wanted to be a federal judge. And Lincoln kept putting him off and putting him off and putting him off. And finally, it just happened that there was a justice of the peace there in Washington who had gone out one afternoon canoeing in the Potomac River. And as misfortune would have it, his canoe upset and he drowned. And as soon as this guy found out that the judge had drowned, the justice had drowned in the Potomac River, he made a beeline for the hospital, for the White House, and he went charging into Lincoln's office. He said, that justice of the peace in Washington has drowned and his job is open. And Lincoln said, you're too late. I appointed a man to push him in. And because he was pastored literally every day, I mean by the hundreds, people would line up in the hall trying to get appointed to something. And finally, in the fall of 1862, he developed a case of smallpox. Thankfully, it wasn't lethal. But he did ask the doctor, he said, am I contagious? And the doctor said, I believe you are. And he said, well, good. At last I've got something I can give everybody. He was in his office, and one of his secretaries, John Nicolay, said, Mr. President, here come Mr. Julian and Mr. Stevens and Mr. Chandler from Illinois, or from Michigan. And Lincoln said, you know, that reminds me of when I was in blab school. He said, when I was in blab school, the teacher would make us read out of the Bible, and we'd always read from the book of Daniel. And she was partial to the story of the Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. And she'd give each of us a paragraph to read, and he said there was one boy, and you know, we'd all look ahead and see what our paragraph was, and there was one boy who just could not pronounce the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he'd look down the list to see where it was, and then he'd say, oh, it's those three fellows again. And Lincoln said, when you told me that those guys were coming up to see me, he said, I just thought of that kid. There's three fellows again. Because these people were abolitionists, and they were always on, they were trying to help Lincoln be president, trying to help him. And one time Lincoln was Seward, and they had gone to visit the troops. And in the process of visiting the troops, they saw a teamster trying to get a wagon over a creek, and the mule skinner was trying to do that. And as you probably don't know, in the 21st century, mule skinners, in order to persuade the mules to do whatever it is they do, sometimes use pretty colorful language. And the more stubborn the mules were, the more colorful the language became. And Lincoln sat there and he watched this guy trying to get this wagon over the creek, and he was turning the air blue with all kinds of obscenities and blasphemies and so forth. And finally Lincoln said to him, he said, son, are you an Episcopalian? And this mule skinner, not thinking about what he was doing, you know, being interrupted, he turned around, saw who it was. He said, no, I'm a Presbyterian. He said, well, I could have sworn you were an Episcopalian. Governor Seward here swears just like that, and he's an Episcopalian. Of course, the favorite of Lincoln's humor were the generals. The generals. Nobody escaped Lincoln's humor. And he said of John Fremont, John Fremont was the first Republican candidate for president in 1856, and later general in the Union Army, been defeated by Stonewall Jackson, all that sort of thing. But Lincoln said of Fremont that he is the damnedest scoundrel that ever lived, but in the infinite mercy of Providence, he's also the damnedest fool. McClellan. I don't know how much you know about General George McClellan, but McClellan, you know, was pretty good at training the Army. He wasn't too good at getting them to fight at anybody, but he was pretty good at he was pretty good at training the Army. And, you know, he put the Army together, he'd have parades, and he'd teach them how to camp and how to march and how to fire their weapons and so forth. He wasn't going to take them into battle, get them killed or anything. He's just going to march them around. And finally, Lincoln was very impatient with McClellan. He said, I wonder if the general's not going to use the Army, if I could borrow it for a while. And he often described McClellan as having the slows. He said, McClellan has the slows. One time Lincoln went to see McClellan, and he and John Hay and Secretary Seward had all gone to McClellan's house, and they were sitting in, the general wasn't there, he was out at a wedding reception, and the butler told him that he wasn't there, and he was out at a wedding reception, he said, but invited them to wait in the parlor, which they did, and they were sitting there in the parlor probably for half, three-quarters of an hour, and all of a sudden McClellan came in, and the butler told McClellan that the president was in the parlor, and McClellan went on upstairs, and he was up there about a half an hour, and finally John Hay went to the butler and he said, "Did you tell the general that the president was waiting to see him?" He said, "I did, but let me go remind him." So he went upstairs and he came back down and he said, "The general's gone to bed." Try that with your boss. And as they're walking out of the house and back to the White House, you know, Seward is just lambasting McClellan like you can't imagine. And Lincoln said, "Well, I'd hold McClellan's horse if he'd give us victories." You know, he wasn't concerned with the insult. He was just concerned that he wanted to win. But one time, after the 7 days battle down on the peninsula, which McClellan hadn't done such a great job at, and Lincoln went down to interview McClellan to find out if he should bring the army back to Washington. This is in the summer of 1862. Bring him back to defend Washington or leave him there off for another try at Richmond. He'd gone down there with Montgomery Meigs. Montgomery Meigs was the quartermaster general of the United States Army. And as they're down there, Lincoln loved to meet with the troops. He's talking to the soldiers and so forth. And as they passed by near the headquarters, there were some workmen out there digging a privy. He's not sure what a privy is. A privy is an outside of the treaty, for those of you not familiar with the term. And there were some carpenters there who were going to build a little house to fit over the pit. And as they passed by as General Meigs and Lincoln passed by, one of the carpenters called out, he said, "General, sir," he said, "should we make this a one-holer or a two-holer?" And before Meigs could answer, Lincoln stopped him and he said, "You better make it a one-holer, son. If you made it two, by the time McClellan made up his mind, it would be too late." Hooker. Fighting Joe Hooker. Actually, that's not his name. You know, he got that known to Garrett from one of the comma. There was a report in one of the Baltimore papers that was supposed to say "fighting, comma, Joe Hooker," but they let the comma, the typesetter let the comma out, so it was read "Fighting Joe Hooker," and he was called "Fighting Joe Hooker" the rest of his life. Anyway, just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, Hooker's got these elaborate plans of how he's going to get Lee to abandon his works there at Fredericksburg. And he says, either General Lee will come out and give us battle on ground of our own choosing, or ingloriously fly. God have mercy on General Lee, for I shall have none. And Lincoln heard that and he said, "You know, I think the hen is the wisest of the animals, because she cackles only after the egg is laid." General Grant. What could you say about General Grant? Lincoln made very little fun of General Grant. When people tried to fire him because he said he was drinking, you know, he said, "I cannot spare this man, he fights." And once he gets a hold of a piece of ground, he holds it like he inherited it. And when he thought about bringing Grant to the east, the cabinet was opposed to it. They didn't know that Grant was going to be all that good. They said, "You know, and there's a reputation that he's been drinking and so forth. We're not sure that he's the man." And Lincoln said, "All right, I realize that some of you are not familiar with General Grant." He said, "I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's put it to a vote. Those in favor of General Grant say aye." And Lincoln said aye, and Gideon Wells and a few others said aye. And he says, "Okay, everybody opposed say nay." And the rest of them said nay. He says, "The ayes have it." And they always tell the story about Grant, and it's probably apocryphal, how some ministers had come to see Lincoln and complaining about General Grant. And he said, "I understand you have complaints about it." And he said, "We do. We don't mind that he's a good soldier, but we do object to his drinking." Lincoln said, "You do?" And they said, "Yeah, he's a drunkard." Lincoln says, "Well, maybe what we ought to do is find out what he's drinking and give a barrel of it to the other generals." And then there's always, if you've seen the Lincoln movie, this story was in the Lincoln movie. Somebody asked the story of the British and General Washington's picture. And one of the Brits said, "You know where we hang General Washington's picture?" Lincoln said, I didn't know you had pictures of General Washington. They said, oh yes, we always hang them in the water closet. He said, well, I think that's probably a fitting place. There's nothing that'll scare it out of the British like a picture of General Washington. The last story that I know that Lincoln ever told was in his final cabinet meeting. His cabinet meeting was on April 14th, 1865, Good Friday. And it started at 11 o'clock, and then the subject was Reconstruction. Lee had surrendered the previous Palm Sunday, and they were getting together. Grant was at the meeting, and they were getting together to figure out exactly how they should deal with the South. Some wanted to divide them into military districts and occupation and all that sort of thing. Lincoln said, no. He said, I don't think we want to do that. He said, I want to let them up easy. He said, other civil wars, they take all the revolutionaries and they stand them up against the wall and shoot them. He said, I don't want to do that. I don't want no hanging. I don't want any bloodbath. I want to just let them up easy. And he said, what if we captured Jefferson Davis and the others? What should we do with them? And Lincoln said, that reminds me of a farmer back in Illinois. The eyeballs start to roll, and he says, you know, there was this fella, this farmer who had taken the pledge. Now, for those of us in the 21st century, it's not always clear as to what that means, he took the pledge. But in those days, they were inundated with people who would drink quite a bit. And, you know, if they promised to go on the wagon and stay sober, they'd sign a pledge card. And, you know, I promised not to drink anymore the rest of my life. And they'd get him on record, they'd put it in writing, and he was going to take the pledge. So this farmer had taken the pledge. And it was a hot day in July, and he'd gone over to visit his neighbor, and the neighbor was sitting on the porch in the shade. So the farmer went up, and he sat on the porch in the shade with the neighbor, and they were rocking back and forth and telling stories and talking about the weather and one thing and another. Pretty soon, the neighbor said to the farmer, he said, would you like some lemonade? And the farmer said, oh, that would be nice. He said, should I put a little something, something in there for you? And the farmer said, well, I've taken the pledge. But if you did put a little something, something in there for me and I didn't know it, I couldn't be responsible for that. Lincoln said, like that farmer back in Illinois, if you just sort of let those Confederate leaders get away and I didn't know anything about it, he said, I couldn't be held responsible for that. So let down the bars, scare them off. If they want to leave, let them leave. Well, that night, of course, he went to the theater to enjoy the play, Our American Cousin. I don't know how familiar you are with the play. It's not much of a play. It's the story of two families. One is the story of Asa Trenchard, who is the American cousin. And Asa Trenchard has been extremely wealthy in his life, but has fallen on hard times, and his fortune has somewhat dwindled away. So he, in an effort to rescue his extravagant lifestyle, decides to go visit his cousins in Great Britain, the Mount Chessingtons. And the Mount Chessingtons at one time were quite wealthy people too. But like Asa Trenchard, they have fallen on hard times, and their fortune too has dwindled to practically nothing. But they're thrilled to find out that their rich American cousin is going to come and visit them. So each of them had been wealthy, no longer wealthy, expects that the other one is still wealthy and is willing to share. And that's sort of the plot of the story. And the funniest line in the play is when Mrs. Mount Chessington finds out that Asa Trenchard is broke. And she accuses him of not having good manners. And she says, you, sir, do not have the manners of good society. And she throws her nose in the air and stalks off the stage. And Harry Hawk, the actor playing Asa Trenchard, is the only actor on the stage. And he delivered the funniest line in the play. He said, don't have the manners of good society, eh? Well, I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sockdologizing old man trap. And as he delivers the line, 1,600 people in Ford's Theater erupt in laughter, and it was at that very moment that John Wilkes Booth stepped into Lincoln's box and put a bullet in the back of his head. The last conscious sound that Lincoln must have heard thank you for your attention. And I appreciate you coming out on the first snow we've seen all winter. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Sir?
How are these stories documented? In newspaper articles or journals?
They're recorded in diaries. Some people, you know, I will tell you that after Lincoln died, everybody had a Lincoln story. Many of them are probably apocryphal, but there were enough people in the cabinet meetings and enough people who'd come to visit him in his office that reminds me of the story of a farmer back in Illinois part is absolutely crucial. Gideon Wells was a great diarist. Salmon Chase was a pretty good diarist, although he did not like Lincoln. Gideon Wells wrote down everything, good, bad, and otherwise. I mean, he just recorded everything. Lincoln's own secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, later in their lives wrote a 10-volume history of Lincoln. 10 volumes. I've not read that. But if you, I'd be interested when you read it, you give me a report. So there's a lot of that, and you know, a lot of people, you know, are going to make up stories about Lincoln. Is some of it true? Some of it must be true. A lot of what went on in Illinois is absolutely true, because one lawyer in Illinois said to a judge when Lincoln was riding the circuit, he said to the judge, he said, "He's a lot smarter than he looks." And you know, there's people around here who say that. So and another source is Billy Herndon, his law partner. Now Herndon did not follow him to Washington, but Herndon wrote the first biography of Lincoln, so a lot of it comes from Herndon. That's an excellent point. Yes, ma'am.
How old was Lincoln when he died?
56.
Thank you.
In Ken Burns' Civil War, if you've seen the series. If you haven't seen the series, take it out from the library. I mean, it takes you 14 hours to watch the whole thing. So, and I recommend it. You know, it's just a moving experience. But in Ken Burns' Civil War, one of the mistakes that is made in that is they report Lincoln as 54. He was 56. He was born in 1809. He turned 56 in February and died in April.
What did you think of the movie?
I like the Lincoln movie. I'm typically not a very good movie goer. I used to love, I'm a great, I mean, when I was a kid, I'd go to the movies twice a week. But in my older years, I found out that I would get into the movie and, you know, get situated in my seat, take my coat off, and 10 minutes into the movie, I'm fast asleep. And since I'm not particularly interested in spending $12 for a nap, I'm very rarely go to the movies. But I told that to one of my friends. She said, "Take your wife in and have her poke you if you fall." Well, she didn't have to poke me. I thought it was an excellent movie. I don't know. I'm not sure the House of Representatives actually looked like that, but I thought it was an excellent portrayal of the events that took place. And I thought that Daniel Day-Lewis just did a marvelous job portraying Lincoln as Lincoln really was. You know, I think we have a tendency to make Lincoln larger than life, larger than he actually was. And I don't, you know, we expect so much of him. We expect him to be all things, but he was regular people like you and me. He was a common man. Put his pants on one leg at a time and everything. But the people who describe Lincoln, the biographers and the people who studied Lincoln, I mean Frank Williams and the people who really know this stuff, say that Lincoln was absolutely the shrewdest politician we ever had. Absolutely, and one of the most brilliant. Although he wasn't well schooled. He only had a year's education in his whole life. When he was in Congress, he's filling out the form in Congress, and when it comes to education, he wrote defective. It's true. He'd only been to school 1 year in his whole life, and that not all at one time. You know, he would go 3 months here and 4 months there. He just never had the opportunity. He was truly self-taught. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
How realistic do you think, you know, we know that he was melancholic and that he was an insomniac. I think Day-Lewis's portrayal of him, he just looked exhausted all the time. And just his gait, his walk. How realistic is that, do you think?
John Hay gave a description of Lincoln in his last week of his life. And he said he walked like a man whose feet hurt. Lincoln was exhausted. He worked 18 hours a day. He fought harder than any soldier in the war. He absolutely did. He managed everything. For a while, he was the only general the Union had. Because the others had, and forgive me, it's not their fault. I don't mean to be critical of the United States Army in any way. I'm serious about that. Nobody had any concept of how to manage troops in the field. The largest fighting force we'd ever had in the whole history of the country was 35,000 people, and that was the invasion of Mexico in the 1840s. No general had ever led more than 30,000 troops on the field at any one time. The day after they fired on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Who's going to manage it? Who's going to train them? Who's going to equip them? Who's going to put them in uniform? Who's going to, and these people don't know their right from their left. They're coming from literally all over the country. How do you get these people organized and into war and win? To us, from our 21st century perspective, we look back and say it's easy to do. Yeah, try that. How many of you are campers? Campers. I don't mean in an RV, I mean campers. Outside. Night like tonight. No tent. Okay? That's what those troops did. They stayed out on nights like tonight because they didn't have any tents. They slept on the ground. Cold, wet, and the few they ate, you and I wouldn't give that to dogs. We wouldn't. They ate salt pork and hardtack and coffee. The government issued them coffee beans. They didn't issue them coffee. So these guys had beans, and they'd use their rifle butts to mash up the beans on rocks and then put it in the boiling water. Bruce Catton said it saved a lot of lives, not because the coffee was so great, but because they boiled the water and that killed the germs that were in the water. When we think about the casualties of the Civil War, 750,000, about 400,000 of them died from disease. How would you like to go through life with a constant 4-year episode of diarrhea? So, and Lincoln tried everything he could think of to make life better. Blankets for the Army, tents for the Army, uniform, shoes, guns, bullets, coats, everything that he could think of. And when Mary spent the money on, as he called it, flub dubs for this old barn, he was very upset with her for doing that. And he offered to pay the money out of his own pocket. Congress finally coughed up the $25,000. And to us, $25,000 doesn't seem like a lot of money. In those days, that would be comparable to about $2,500,000. Questions?
I was curious about his mother, his birth mother.
Nancy Hanks?
What happened? Yes.
Nancy Hanks died of what they called the milk sickness when Lincoln was 9. She died shortly after they moved to Indiana. And here's Tom Lincoln. He's got Abe and a little girl and a cousin living with him, and realizes that he can't leave these children alone and go out and work in the field. So he went back to Kentucky and he found a widow who had 4 children of her own, Sarah Bush Johnson. And he brought her to Indiana, and it was a marriage of convenience. But she was absolutely a wonderful mother. And Lincoln said, all I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my mother. And I have a feeling that it was Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln that he was talking about, because this woman saw in him tremendous potential. She kept Tom away from him so he could read. Tom thought he was lazy. She knew he was just improving his mind. So, she probably, and of all the people, when his father died, he didn't go to the funeral. But after he was elected, and before the train left for Washington, he made a trip out to Cole County, Illinois, to see her, to give her a hug and so forth. And when she found out, she said, they killed my boy. Pretty heart-wrenching stuff. Yes, ma'am. The question is, what's milk sickness? And the short answer is, I have no idea. I just don't know. My guess is it's some kind of fever, but I don't know what it is. Maybe it could have been poison milk, much like typhoid. Who knows? They did, and I will tell you that I am absolutely grateful to live in the 21st century with indoor plumbing and central heating and electrical needs and air conditioning and all the rest of it. You know, as inconvenient as life is, it's nothing compared to what they had. Sir?
Which biographer or reference do you respect the most about Lincoln and why?
The question is, which of the Lincoln biographies do I respect the most? And I would say that I've read two of Lincoln's biographies that I consider to be just excellent. One is Stephen Oates with Malice Toward None. Oates won the Pulitzer Prize when that book was first published back in 1976. It's been released in paperback. I'm sure they have copies here in the library. The good news is it's available on recorded books. And if you are like I am, you listen to books while you're riding in the car, that's just an excellent source. Stephen Oates with Malice Toward None. The other book was written by David Herbert Donald. David Herbert Donald was a history professor at Harvard University and the student of James Garfield Randall, J.G. Randall, who wrote the definitive book on the Civil War and Reconstruction back in the 1930s. Herbert Donald was not only his student, he was also his son-in-law. And they prevailed on Donald to write this book on Lincoln back in the 1990s, and it was published in 1995 and won the Lincoln Prize. And what Donald did was to take everything that crossed Lincoln's desk. If Lincoln didn't see it, it's not in the book. And he's a masterful writer. I'm not sure he's that great a storyteller, but he's a masterful writer, and for the accuracy, it's very good. I have not read Burlingame's recent book on Lincoln, 2 volumes, nor have I read John Hay and John Nicolai's 10-volume history biography of Lincoln. But I have read those two, and they're both excellent. That's just the beginning. I will tell you that there are 3,000 books and 16,000 articles all written on Lincoln, so if you get started tonight, you can check out a book on your way home. Others? No other questions? Well, thank you again for coming out on a snowy evening night.
Please leave your evaluation forms on your seats, and please be careful on the way out. I hear it's slippery out there.
The question is, who's my favorite president? And the students ask me that a lot.
That's how bad it's getting.
The short answer is, have you been to South Dakota?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Your future's ahead of you. Go to the Black Hills in South Dakota and you'll see Mount Rushmore. And I would say that the people who are on Mount Rushmore, who are portrayed on Mount Rushmore, are in their places. All the others, not so much. So, you know, I would say that Mount Rushmore had, you know, there's a lot to be said for General Washington. There's certainly a lot to be said for Abraham Lincoln. Theodore Roosevelt is the only great president that America's had who got his greatness without a war. He was president for 8 years with no wars and did everything he could think of to keep us out of war, although he prepared indomitably for war. He said that, you know, people won't pick on you if you're prepared. And, you know, I have great respect